Hello, my name is Marco Repetto, and today for Vertex Tutors, we'll be going over the 2014 Microeconomic Free Response question number 3. So let's get started. On question number A, it asks, draw a correctly labeled graph of the gasoline market. On your graph, show the equilibrium price and the quantity of gasoline labeled PE and QE. So let's make our graph as we would. And remember, it says that the demand is relatively inelastic and that supply is relatively elastic. Along with that, we are in a competitive market. So that means obviously we have to sell the exact price of the marginal cost or the cost that it takes to produce an additional unit, or else we won't get any sales. So as we know, this is the price and this is the quantity in a supply and demand chart. So now let's get on to graphing the actual curves. So it says that demand is relatively inelastic. And what we can take that as is if something is inelastic, that means that people will buy it no matter how much the price changes. So because it's not extremely inelastic or perfectly inelastic, then that means that it is vertical, but it is not perfectly vertical. It is more at a slant because no matter the price, people will still buy it. So the demand curve would be something like this because it is very steep, but it is not perfectly vertical. And then the supply is relatively elastic, which means that the price has to stay at around the same area or else suppliers will not supply. So that graph would look something like this. You see, it is a rather small slope, yet it is not perfectly horizontal because it is not perfectly elastic. It is simply relatively elastic. So if we look at where those meet for the PE and QE, that would be around right here. And that means that this is QE and that is PE. PE and then QE. So we did question number A. Let's move on to B. Suppose the government imposes a $2 per unit tax on the producers of gasoline. On your graph from part A, show each of the following after the tax is imposed. First, the price paid by buyers labeled PB. Well, first let's get this $2 tax on the graph. So if there's a $2 tax, that increases the cost that it takes to buy or to get and to sell the gasoline. So that would affect this supply curve, not the demand curve. And because there's a $2 increase or a $2 tax, that means that the price would be higher for gasoline. And it would shift upwards and be something like this. And that means that the new price where the where the buyers have to buy the gasoline is up here. And we can label that PB. So after this $2 tax, the suppliers would be incentivized to supply less. As you see down here, the quantity is less. The demand would be lower because the demand has to pay less, and the suppliers would have to charge more to earn the same or even less amount. So that was part one. Let's move on to part two, the after-tax price received by the sellers. So this is the price that the sellers would have to sell it at, although that is not the price where the sellers would receive all that money. Because there's that $2 tax, that means that it is this price minus that $2, which would end up being right here. That is because you have to take that $2 off this PB in order to get the supply that there would have been beforehand. And to get that same amount, we'd have to take off the tax as we established earlier. And that would be PS. Then question 3 says the quantity and label that QT. The quantity for that would be down here. And earlier we established why the quantity is lower, because suppliers will not be as incentivized to supply as much if they have to sell it and earn less profit. So that is it for question B. Question C asks us, using the labeling on your graph, explain how to calculate the total tax revenue collected by the government. So if we have the price that they sell it at and the price that they received, that means that the government receives any price in between these areas. Because again, this line PB is where they sell it at, and this line is where this line is what the suppliers receive. So if we take the area in between, we'd get PB minus PS. Although the thing is, that would be for one product or for one, say, gallon of gasoline. If we want to get the total amount, we'd have to take into account the quantity that is being sold. And because it is this amount that the government receives per every gallon, that would mean we multiply it times the quantity, or QT. So that is essentially question C, because we don't have numbers attached to this. Although if we did, we could just plug them into the formula and receive how much the government receives. So let's move on to question D. Will a tax burden fall entirely on buyers, entirely on sellers, more on buyers, less on sellers, more on sellers, less on buyers, or equally for buyers and sellers? So for this question, we have to remember that demand is relatively inelastic and supply is very elastic. So essentially what that means is whatever the price change, buyers will have to still buy this product, or well, generally will have to still buy this product, and suppliers can essentially change however much they charge. So with this tax, that means that suppliers could charge more, and then at the same time, the buyers or the demand would still have to buy. So with this tax, most of the burden would fall on the buyers because they would essentially still have to buy after this price increase, and the suppliers would gain generally the same amount. It is not exactly the same amount because remember, it is relatively inelastic. So it is not entirely on the sellers or entirely on the buyers, although it is most of the burden would fall on the buyers because they will still have to buy after this price increase, and the suppliers will generate generally the same amount of wealth because they can sell it for simply the increased price and still gain the same amount of sales. So with that, we completed question number 3. Remember to subscribe and drop a like below, and I'll see you next time.